Today we will see how a single annotation completely changed the way Spring MVC was configured and managed. In the current times, we have Spring Boot, which takes care of most of the boilerplate configurations so that the developer can concentrate more on implementing the business logic. But before Spring Boot, creating a Spring MVC application required a lot of configuration related to dispatcher servlets, view resolver, handler mapping, and many more things. EnableWebMvc annotation was introduced in Spring 3.1 and has played an important role in shifting the configuration ways in Spring MVC. Now, before we start, if you are new, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so that you won't miss any new updates. Now, let us see how the things were before this annotation. Prior to enable WebMVC annotation, configuring a Spring MVC application involved a lot of XML configuration, which are essential to the web application. Let us first check dispatcher servlet and servlet mapping configuration. This configuration is done in web.xml file. The web.xml file, also known as deployment descriptor, is a standard part of J2EE web applications. It provides configuration and deployment information for the web components that includes servlets and servlet mappings. In this example, the dispatcher servlet is defined along with the class and its full package details. Load on startup value is given as 1. That means this particular servlet will be loaded to the memory when the application is booting up. That will ensure it's ready to handle the request immediately after the application is up and running. Next is servlet mapping with URL pattern. In this, the same name dispatcher is used and the URL pattern / is used. That means the dispatcher servlet we just had defined in the beginning will be responsible for handling the requests. The pattern / indicates that this servlet handles all the requests that are not mapped to any other servlet. That will make it a default central point for request handling. The next important component that we need to configure is context param. In this, we specify the location of Spring configuration file. The configuration we are currently looking at is not specific to Spring. Web.xml is a standard part of J2EE web application and not related to Spring directly. In the context param, we provide the file name and location of that XML file, which contains Spring specific configurations, which we have already seen in one of our previous Spring related videos. We can define beans, wire them together, and many more other configuration in that particular XML file. Let us explore this XML also. From the naming side, you can name it anything, but the same name has to be configured in web.xml. This XML typically includes component scanning, view resolver configuration, and other Spring beans needed for the web application. Now inside the beans markup tag, which is a root tag here, we have first child tag, which is MVC annotation driven. This element enables support for annotation driven controllers and other annotations like request mapping, response body, etc. Next markup tag is context component scan. This element asks the Spring to scan the specified package for classes or interfaces, which will be annotated with @controller, service, repository, and component. This allows for automatic detection and registration of those components as Spring's managed beans. Next is a bean definition for configuring a view resolver. This we have already discussed in detail in one of our previous MVC video itself. If you want the detailed session on that, you can check it out from the playlist. So this setup was essential but required a considerable amount of boilerplate code that makes the configuration process more error prone and difficult to manage. The introduction of EnableWebMvc annotation and Java-based configuration simplified this approach significantly. That allows developers to write more concise and readable configuration code directly in Java. Now we have seen how things were before EnableWebMvc annotation. Let us see how it got changed after the introduction of this annotation. This is our web config class, which implements WebMvcConfigurer interface. Before we see what all features this interface provides, let us first check few annotations used here. If you see on top of this class, we are using enable WebMVC annotation. Along with that, a couple of more annotations such as configuration and component scan. Now let us check all these annotations as well. @configuration indicates that the class can be used by Spring IOC container as a source of bean definitions. This class specifically the replacement of XML configuration file where we used to define the beans. @component scan will allow Spring to automatically detect and register the beans within the specified package and its sub packages also. It replaces that context component scan XML configuration. Now we have implemented WebMvc configurer interface. This interface provides default methods that can be overridden to customize various aspects of Spring MVC. If we want to customize resource handling such as static resource mapping, then we can override add resource handler method and provide our own implementation. To customize view resolvers, we can override configure view resolver method. If we want to register custom interceptors in our application, then we can override add interceptors method. Spring provides automatic conversion to various types such as JSON, XML, to and from simple Java objects. If we want to customize the list of message converters, then we can override configure message converters method from this particular interface. Also, in case we want to add some custom formatters, in that case, we can override add formatters method as well. If we do not provide any implementation of our own, then the default implementation will be available from this interface itself. Now coming back to the main topic, enable WebMvc annotation. Enable WebMvc annotation simplifies the configuration by enabling a set of default configurations and behaviors. Let us see what all it takes care of. The first one is dispatcher servlet initialization. So if you remember in web.xml, we have to define a dispatcher servlet and its mapping, and also need to make sure that it should load on the startup of the application. So that we do not need to do if we are using enable WebMvc annotation. So using this annotation, it sets up the dispatcher servlet by configuring it with the necessary components for request handling automatically. Next is request mapping. It automatically registers a request mapping handler mapping bean, which scans for @request mapping annotation on controller methods and map them to the appropriate URLs. It registers a request mapping handler adapter bean that processes request mapped by the previously created request mapping bean as well. Then comes exception handling. It configures an exception handler exception resolver bean that allows the usage of @exception handler annotation on methods in controllers to handle the exception. So if you remember, we can use @exception handler annotation inside a controller or even in a separate controller advice as well. So to enable that particular functionality, WebMvc will be able to help us by configuring exception handler exception resolver bean. It also automatically configures a resource handler registry to serve the static resources such as CSS, JavaScript, and other images. One more option that this particular annotation helps us to customize properly is view resolution. The custom internal resource view resolver being defined in the Java class, which replaces the need of view resolver configuration in the XML which we have seen earlier. This resolver translates the logical view names returned by controller method into the actual physical view resources that can be an HTML file or a JSP file. So all in all, the combination of enable WebMvc annotation with Java-based configuration simplifies the setup of Spring MVC application. Most of the boilerplate configurations are handled automatically by importing default settings. All configurations can be managed in a single Java class, making the setup more cohesive and easier to maintain. Developers can leverage Java features such as type safety and refactoring tools such as IDEs, which are not possible with XML configurations. And of course, we have already seen by implementing WebMvcConfigurer, developers can easily customize the default configurations provided by enable WebMvc annotation. So in the end, just to summarize, before Spring Boot, EnableWebMvc annotation was a game changer for Spring MVC application. It reduces the complexity of configuration, provided a more powerful and flexible approach to set up a web application that made the codebase more maintainable and readable. By utilizing the power of Java-based configuration and use of annotations, it makes the development experience smoother within Spring ecosystem. That was it for today's video. If you find it useful, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you so much for connecting. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, happy coding.